Well, I came to Malmesbury to live in 1965. I came here to work. I was working for Pye Limited. I'd been working for them in Cambridge, and then I did my army service and then went over to Ireland to work for them. I worked in Ireland for about 9 years, and I was coming backwards and forwards here with little jobs. They were doing some jobs for us. And then when Pye closed their factory in Ireland, I really was looking for a job in the Pye group, but I'd made a lot of friends here and they asked me to come here. In fact, they asked me to come here to help them to make gas fires. Now, I know nothing about gas fires, and I'm very grateful that we didn't make any gas fires.
Derek, those Echo years, what stands out that makes Echo special to you?
It had been set up as a wartime factory, and we were self-contained. We could make anything that was down there. We'd make the tools, and the raw material would go in, it'd be folded, painted, made into an electric fire or a radio set. We could make anything down there, and they were very keen people, lovely people to work with. One of the things that I very quickly got involved with in the department I was working with was the Echo Children's Christmas Party. And that encapsulated everything about Malmesbury, because although they ran a party down there for the employees, most of the people in the town had some link to the Echo factory, but they would send out invitations to all the children of the school. The rules were, as long as the child had gone to school and could behave itself away from its mother, we would take them to the party. And it really was a fantastic thing to be involved in. I organised a swindle with the girls, a little football thing to raise the money. We didn't seem to need to have a lot of money in those days, but what we would do would decorate the canteen up. Some of the electricians and the boys would draw these cartoon characters. They would have enough little bulbs that should have found their way on the front of radio sets to decorate all the illuminated Mickey Mouses and things to get them to move. In fact, it was such a highlight of the Christmas party season that they used to open up the canteen and people used to walk from Malmesbury to the Echo canteen to see the decorations before the parties. And we organised it like a military operation. Now, you're talking about a time when there wasn't a lot of cars, and we used to write to the children their invitation. My boss used to insist that every child had his own printed invitation card. It wasn't to the Smith children. Every child would get an envelope with a stamp on it with their name on it, inviting them to the party. We would arrange buses to bring the children. How health and safety would cope with it today, but the children used to be picked up with buses, and these are from 5 years up to 11. They'd been picked up in the country because we had children working, their mothers were working in the country areas as well. We'd pick up the children. They used to come in, each child had a label, rather the same way as we would, as like an evacuee, and it was modified from how we ran the radios through the factory. So they used to come with their little mittens and their hats and the gloves. We'd take all their bits and pieces from them, put them in the cloakroom. We knew exactly where it was. The children would then be processed through. The first thing we'd have in the canteen would be set up for a tea. Tables everywhere. The biggest number we ever had for a party there was 300 children.
Wow.
It was hard to cope with those, but we did. So all the tables were set up. We had a tea. Tea was absolutely fantastic. Kids didn't want to eat very much. After the tea, we had an organisation to clear all the tables away, and then we would put on a little film show. The film show, Mr. Jim Butler from Shurston, now no longer with us, but he would organise the film show. And in those days, as long as you had cartoons, the children loved it, because there's no videos, no television sets for that, and they would watch the cartoons. We soon realised that Jim was suffering a little bit because the children were starting to run about, and we very quickly devised a system so that we had a system of back projection. So we put the projector up, ran through a mirror, 90 degrees, and back screen projection for the things. And then we had an entertainer. We would always have a professional entertainer in there to entertain the children. Sometimes they were good, sometimes they were unbelievable. On one occasion we had a little Chinaman and his daughter who came and entertained us. I watched Harvey Frayling, he was the fire chief. He was following this chap around because he thought he was drinking. And in fact, after he'd taken a little swig of this bottle, out came a match and a great plume of flame went out up in amongst all the Christmas decorations. And he then asked for a volunteer, and he got one tiny little lad who just filled himself up with jelly, set him up on his back and juggled with this poor little mud who went round and round on his feet. After all that was there, we had some electronic boys who were very, very clever. And at a particular stage, we knew something was going up. We had the Father Christmas already organised in a sleigh, and you would hear an aircraft or a helicopter appear to land on the roof. And the children, everybody would believe when Father Christmas came in. And of course, with so many children, the ones at the end of the queue were always very nervous whether the presents would last. In fact, any new helpers used to say, "What do you do if you run out of presents?" And I say, "Well, we've never run out of presents, but what would you do if you ran out of presents?" I said, "Well, what all the men do is to take off their watches and we put our watches on the stage. And the next time you bumped into this chap, he'd got his watch in his pocket." Well, the presents, what we used to do, would go to the post office. We'd always order enough presents and get a lot of post office sacks, fill them up with boxes and paper and put more presents on the top, so that the child who was last would still see that there were presents for everybody. We did always invite parties of children from Burton Hill School, where the handicapped children were there. And when it came to selecting presents for the children, we would always choose harmless little presents like post office printing sets. But when we had the terrible thalidomide, we had these little lads there with no real arms and legs, more or less like little flippers. They were funny little lads there, but they didn't want post office sets, they wanted footballs. So at the end of the afternoon, when we were all waiting for the special bus to come and pick them up for the Burton Hill School, they were quite horrified to find our fellas playing football with these lads, and these little lads were running around the floor enjoying football. That was what they wanted. They didn't want tame games.
So, what happened to you, Derek, after you left Echo?
Echo closed up, but they are rather sad. I mean, the same as when I worked in Ireland. The big companies were working on government grants. And when the government grants ran out, they wanted to shut down the factories. And it was pretty well the same here. They decided that they had work up in Scotland, and they wanted to go up in Scotland. I travelled up and down to Scotland, and they took all our work up to Glasgow. I used to go up to Glasgow for about 6 months, going up there in the week, but they wanted to do things their own way, and eventually I decided I'd had enough of that. I was unemployed for a short while, built myself a little workshop, made a lot of toys and was happy. And then I went to work for Richard Cooper, doing the printed labels for his price marker guns. I was doing the artworks for those. In fact, it was a very, very enjoyable time, because the artworks had to be absolutely right to be able to print the shopkeeper's name on that little tiny label. We did early labels up for Tracklements and for anybody that wanted sticky labels. It was an interesting time. And then it wasn't a real job for me, and I took a job with North Wilts. They wanted somebody to go round North Wiltshire and to identify, measure and set up a plan of all the grass that they cut in North Wiltshire. I mean all the grass. They really didn't know how much grass they'd got. As long as the crews with the mowing machines came back wet and dirty and there weren't that many complaints, they were quite happy. But it was a question of trying to identify these areas, measure them. They were all strange shapes in every village around. I decided I knew I'd got to do Chippenham, Wootton Bassett, Calne, and they were much too big for me to tackle. So I'd pick on a little tiny village like Latin and go and do that first. And then I'd measure the areas, put them down, and I produced several big manuals so that they could go out to quote. And then my boss thought I'd made a fairly good job of it once I'd convinced him the difference between, he expected the areas to be in square yards, and it turned out that I had to put them into square meters, and he couldn't understand the difference. Once I'd explained the shortfall in the numbers that he expected, he then asked me if I would go and help them with organising the rounds of the dustbin men. And I must say, working with the refuse crews was one of the nicest things I had. I did their accident reports, I fitted them up with their uniforms, and I had a lovely time with the refuse crews.
Derek, have you got a memorable story about your time with the refuse men?
That really, it was great fun, and it was hard to separate all of them, but we did have one that really was a very funny. So, the girls in the office used to slip off to have their lunch, and at lunchtime it's quite easy to operate the radio where you were contacting the men and the telephone calls at the same time. You could do it in their little office. And I got a distraught phone call one time at the lunchtime from a lady out at Biddeston. She said that her husband had put out a box of leaves and the bin men had picked it up and thrown it in the back of the cart. She was very distressed because the box of leaves contained their tortoise, which he should not have put out, and the tortoise is now in the back of the cart. Could I please do anything about it? Well, I explained to her there was going to be 11 tons of rubbish on top of this cart, and the chance of finding a tortoise was absolutely nil. But I radioed through to the crew, and they very gallantly, they zipped up to the tip at Compton Bassett, and even the people on the tip cooperated. Usually there's a bully of a man up there with a great big bulldozer with spikes on it that tries to frighten the crews, but they tipped out everything. Now I'm talking about 11 tons of rubbish, bags and bits and pieces. Won't say about dead cats and bits, but eventually they found the tortoise. Couldn't believe it. He'd had a little knock on him, and he was making noises that tortoises don't normally make, hissing noises. Well, they had to go back and finish their round, so they handed over to another refuse crew who collected up some bits of paper and put him in the box and came back with their hazard lights flashing back to the depot. We phoned up the lady and reunited him. He had a Greek name, but by that time we'd called him Lucky. Well, we had a great laugh on this, and I thought it was very funny. So came home, and I was sitting here and thinking about it, and I thought it was jolly funny. So the Wiltshire radio was going, and I picked up the phone and decided to phone up the Wiltshire radio. And I could hear this fella, nasty man, he was saying, "We've got to write one here." And they cut off the radio programme and stuck me on live, and I described the story of how the tortoise was picked up. Well, I laughed and laughed, and I thought it was very funny. Next morning when I went into work, my boss said, "What on earth you been up to?" There was a television crew at the gates there waiting to film the crew. Well, of course the men have strict rounds, they've got to get round there. They wanted to film them. Everyone wanted to know about this blooming tortoise. I had to get the men out clean new uniforms, which they hadn't been wearing. We had to wash the carts down. Honestly, it went round in the silly papers, and those two boys with the tortoise ended up on Blue Peter. The story just went and went.
Could you tell us something about your experiences with Malmesbury Carnival and the flower show?
Yes, I was with the garden club through a colleague at work, and I was always interested in gardening, and I used to grow a few chrysanthemums. It didn't take long, and I was sucked into helping to organise with the flower show. I'd always been interested in running shows and things. In fact, I've got to tell you, when I was in Ireland, I used to run fish shows for tropical fish. I used to run them in Gallagher's canteen in York Street in Belfast. Huge big fish shows, but I'd always been interested in organising things like that. I ended up running the flower show, part of the carnival. In those days, on the bank holiday Monday, we would have the flower show in a huge tent, 90-foot tent, 3 great big poles through the middle. We'd have a dog show, and we'd have a donkey derby, or it's a knockout, something like that. And the flower show was a very important part of it. The carnival committee were very good to us, because if there was any rain or anything like that, we got a great big tent. We used to have competitions for vegetables, flowers, children's competitions, and we'd have a whole series of judges there. Judges to do the wines, lace making, vegetables. Every class had a judge for it. The setting up of the tent was quite a job to set up the tent. One of the problems that I did have, the chairman of our of the garden club then, or of the show committee, was a very religious gentleman and wouldn't allow us to do any work on the Sabbath. So we used to have to set it up on the Saturday and leave it until we did the work on the bank holiday on the Monday. But I used to have to say to him that the tent did need a bit of attention. I'd have to slacken off the guy ropes, otherwise the tent might split. Fetes were absolutely excellent down there. We had many years. This was all at the junior school field. But as the school got bigger and we couldn't get in the entrance there, eventually we ended up at Bremen School up here. We did have one time when we were down at the St Aldham's Mead, when we had a jousting instead of the donkeys. We had horses and knights jousting, and we had to put our tent up down by the river. There was no access to water there except for a bucket to throw into the river there. But I had many years down there. We then moved when the donkeys and the dogs were finished for health and safety and other reasons there, because the donkeys was a little bit hairy. Someone would turn up with a great big truck full of donkeys and a box of tabards and racing helmets, and the children would just go and find a helmet, run round and try to stay on. We'd have a betting on them. There was a tote. So the fetes were great fun there, but you could see things were going. They didn't want dogs on the school fields, and the donkeys were going. So eventually we ended up having our show in the town hall, and last year really was the last year that we were able to have our show in the town hall. Costs and the huge amount of work in there. So this year, for the first time, we're going out to Charlton Village Hall for our show.
I think it's very sad that that you're moving out to Charlton. I heard a while ago a fantastic story that I'm sure can't be true, Derek, from a gentleman I know called Ted Hall, about a baby lion and Longleat and Malmesbury Carnival. Surely this can't be true about a baby lion coming to Malmesbury, can it?
Well, to try and brighten things up one time, I used to have a bit of a nerve in those days. I wrote to Jimmy Chipperfield down at Longleat, and I said, could I borrow a lion? And the outshot was, I thought the children would love to see a lion, and Ted and I went down to Longleat and we picked out a lion. There is a nasty rumour going about that when they said go and help yourself, that I went for a big one and it didn't want to come with me, and we ended up with a small one. But we had the lion, it was on a little lead, brought it up here, laid under our table in the back room there while we had a tea, and children had a lovely time with it. Its name was Lady, and it behaved itself very well. When we got over to Longleat, Ted and I got over to Longleat, we said we'd come over there to pick up a lion, and I got a little bit of paper, but of course I thought it was going to be a fairly big lion, but of course that was ridiculous. This baby lion that we eventually they gave us with, it was quite a handleable lion, about the size of a St Bernard. I've got to tell you, it wasn't a little bit, still got some spots on it, most awful breath. Well, we piled it into the back of Ted's car and we drove back, I've got to say, about that stage, the fashion was, coming back now with a little Churchill dog, to have little nodding dogs in the back of the car. And it was quite something to drive along back from Longleat with this lion nodding in the back of the car. He climbed all over us. He didn't have a seatbelt. I say he, it was a she, but it was great fun.
I know you've been very involved with the River Valleys Trust in the last few years. Could you tell us something about your involvement with the Trust?
My involvement is quite small in that I can physically work at things, and I've done little work to clear the paths and do things. And one of the things that might be interesting for you is I made contact, with the community payback people. These are the people that had to do so many hours work in the community. And we, as a consequence of that, they did a little work in the town hall, and I was involved with them doing some work at the Catholic school. They did work at the nuns' path there. But I had them on a couple of occasions to do work. A group of these came out from Swindon to do work on our path. At one stage we got in a huge amount of gravel, and we got one of these vibrating things, all the wheelbarrows you could imagine, and we were going to put an extra surface on our path, the old path that had been made by the Gurkhas earlier. Well, they were working there on the Sunday, and they were quite nice lads. Some of them were there for very minor offences, most probably whittling in Swindon High Street at night or something like that, but they'd go so many hours community service. What I didn't realise is that the Sunday we were there turned out to be when Ian and Barbara Pollard at Abbey House Gardens had one of their Back to Nature days. So these boys were walking along the road. Now the path is so close, our path is so close to the Pollards at that stage, you wouldn't know where the boundary was. And these naughty boys working off their community saw two little men coming out of the bushes in their birthday suits. Now I've got to tell you, their skin was as white as this shirt, and they had their little socks rolled down, and they were holding hands walking along. Now, we may have thought all sorts of things, but bitten our tongues. These lads decided to tell them what they thought of them, because they were doing community service for less than they thought that what they were looking at. And so they very noisily told, with a lot of expletives, these two fellas what they thought were walking across our mead. Well, one of the gardeners came up to me and he said, "Look, Derek, this is terrible. You can't have them shouting at these men going round this." And I said, well, I brought them all together and I said, "Look, I'm very sorry, we've chosen the wrong day, but these people have come here and they want to go round the garden." And these men and women, oh, as soon as they heard the name women, that was it. Now, I've got to tell you, their supervisor was up at one end with the machine, waiting for the wheelbarrows to arrive. I was down this end, loading the gravel up with the wheelbarrows, sending them off. He sends down a message, "Where are the wheelbarrows?" I'm saying, "I don't know where they are." So we both had to have a hunt out, and there were all the wheelbarrows on the middle of the path, with all the boys sitting on them, waiting for the ladies to appear.